summer of 1940, a handful of bombers from Germany's Luftwaffe dealt Great Britain its deadliest maritime disaster ever. Estimates vary, but in less than an hour, between 4,000 and 7,000 soldiers, sailors, and civilian refugees lost their lives east of Saint-Nazaire along France's Atlantic coast. Witnesses and survivors told tales of unimaginable suffering and bravery, but surprisingly, the incident has largely been forgotten by all but the most die-hard history aficionados. And perhaps more interestingly, much of the information surrounding the tragedy is still classified to this day. This is the story of the HMT Lancastria. The ship that would eventually become the Lancastria was built in Scotland by William Beardmore and Company. It launched into the River Clyde in 1920 as the RMS Tirrenia and entered service with the Anchor Line, a subsidiary of the Cunard Line. At nearly 580 feet long and tipping the scales at 16,000 gross tons, RMS Tirrenia could accommodate 2,200 passengers in addition to its normal complement of mail and cargo. In 1924, the ship was renamed the Lancastria after a number of significant upgrades, and because passengers complained about not being able to pronounce Tirrenia. The Lancastria traveled a dedicated route between Liverpool and New York until 1932, after which she was reassigned to Northern Europe and the Mediterranean. When war broke out in the fall of 1939, the Lancastria was thousands of miles away in the Bahamas and was ordered to sail to New York to be refitted as a troop ship. These latest updates included a new battleship gray paint job and a 4-inch deck gun to provide some measure of defense against enemy subs and surface vessels. In the spring of 1940, the newly christened HMT Lancastria, for His Majesty's Trawler, entered service for the war effort. One of the newly repurposed ship's first orders of business was participating in Operation Alphabet, the evacuation of British, French, and Polish troops from Narvik, Norway, between late May and early June of 1940. A few weeks later, HMT Lancastria was reassigned to yet another evacuation. This time, the plan was to rescue nearly 200,000 British soldiers who'd been pushed to the French coast by the advancing German juggernaut. Operation Ariel isn't as well known as Operation Dynamo at Dunkirk, but at the time, it was considered vital militarily and for overall morale. After all, the beleaguered forces were in particularly vulnerable positions in the ports of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire on the Loire River, and Britain's very existence hung in the balance. To get the servicemen and scores of civilian refugees out of harm's way as quickly as possible, the Admiralty dispatched more than 24 Navy and merchant vessels to the area. The Lancastria was instructed to steam to Saint-Nazaire, but Captain Rudolf Sharp was forced to anchor the ship 5 nautical miles from port because it drew too much water to navigate the shallow tidal channel. This unforeseen setback meant that smaller craft like fishing boats and destroyers had to shuttle evacuees from Saint-Nazaire to the Lancastria. Including loading and unloading, each round trip took an excruciatingly long 3 hours, and shortly into the evacuation, a number of Luftwaffe bombers appeared in the skies overhead. Big, slow, and with no naval escort or air cover, the Lancastria was the proverbial sitting duck. Captain Sharp estimated that the Lancastria could accommodate 3,000 people, but he was instructed to take as many as possible without regard to international maritime law or peacetime safety standards. When it was all said and done, he estimated that 5,500 had boarded. Another senior officer claimed that the real number was closer to 7,200, and some historians argue that it could have been as many as 9,000. Whatever the case, the Lancastria had just 16 lifeboats and 2,500 life jackets. The captain of the British destroyer HMS Havelock advised Captain Sharp to depart as quickly as possible, but he opted to wait for an escort. Meanwhile, at least 5 Junkers Ju-88 dive bombers spotted the Lancastria on the horizon and set upon it with ferocity. With just one 4-inch deck gun, the nearly defenseless ship took multiple hits in short order. Some survivors claimed that a bomb went straight down one of Lancastria's funnels and exploded in the ship's bowels. In a matter of minutes, the fatally wounded ship developed a severe starboard list. Those who survived the initial blast struggled to launch lifeboats that hadn't been destroyed, but the awkward list hindered their efforts. Eventually, at least one boat filled with women and children did make it into the sea, but it capsized moments later. Fearing that the ship would explode or sink without warning, those trapped on deck began jumping overboard by the hundreds. Few had life jackets. Some slammed into the steel hull and were knocked unconscious. Still more landed on frantic survivors who were already in the water. Of those who did manage to get off the ship alive, many drowned instantly or choked on the thick layer of burning fuel oil that seeped out of Lancastria's ruptured tanks. Others died from shock, hypothermia, and blood loss, while German planes strafed anything that moved. But through the unimaginable carnage, some survivors claimed to have seen a group of resolute soldiers standing on the ship's hull singing, "Roll out the barrel." The Lancastria sank just after 4 p.m., about 20 minutes after the initial attack. Nearby vessels rescued as many survivors as they could, but thousands went down with the ship. The following morning, bodies, sometimes in groups of a dozen or more, began appearing on the French coastline adjacent to the Loire River. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was visibly shaken when he learned of the tragedy at Saint-Nazaire. He also decided that the story should be kept out of the press, famously quipping that the newspapers would have plenty of other disasters to cover. As for secrecy, he wanted the story swept under the rug for two main reasons. First, to deprive Germany of a propaganda victory, and second, he knew that news of the tragedy would be yet another blow to an already demoralized public, many of whom feared that their beloved island nation was on the verge of outright collapse. To make sure word didn't leak out, he put a defense notice or D-notice on the incident. D-notices were requests made to newspaper owners and editors, suggesting that certain material not be published on the grounds that it might affect national security. When this news came to me in the quiet cabinet room during the afternoon, I forbade its publication, he said. The newspapers have got quite enough disaster for today at least. Newspaper executives did have some discretion since D-notices weren't mandatory, but they were generally honored without question. However, newspapers in America and elsewhere did run the story. Captain Sharp was one of approximately 2,500 souls who survived the sinking. He never got over the incident, but he continued to do his part for the war effort until mid-September of 1942, when he went down with HMT Laconia when it was sunk by U-156 off the west coast of Africa. Since the wreck is located off the coast of Saint-Nazaire in French territorial waters, it didn't qualify for protection under the UK's Protection of Military Remains Act. However, in 2006, the French government granted the wreck legal protections equivalent to what the UK could provide if it were within their jurisdiction. Surprisingly, under the British Official Secrets Act, reports and documents pertaining to the sinking aren't scheduled for release until 2040, by which time the incident will be even more forgotten than it is now.